Welcome to the 20th anniversary season of the Ian Thompson Forum on World Issues. I'm Harvey Perlman, Chancellor of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The forum was made possible 20 years ago by the vision of the forum's founder, the late Ian Jack Thompson. Jack Thompson was a true Renaissance man and a great friend of the University of Nebraska. This evening's lecture is co-presented as the Kripke Lecture, a collaboration between the Ian Thompson Forum on World Issues and the Norman and Bernice Harris Center for Judaic Studies at this university. We are grateful to all of our partners this evening who generously cooperate with UNL on the forum season: the Cooper Foundation, the Leeds Center for Performing Arts, Nebraska Educational Telecommunications, Cable Channel 21, KRNU Radio, the University Bookstore, and St. Paul United Methodist Church. Over the past 2 decades, the Ian Thompson Forum on World Issue has established itself as one of the preeminent speaker series in higher education. Past Thompson Forum events have featured Mikhail Gorbachev, former president of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Holocaust survivor and peace activist Elie Wiesel, Camelia Sadat, the daughter of Anwar Sadat and founder of the Sadat Peace Institute, Maki Mandela, daughter of the former South African president, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, just to name a few. So it's fitting that our theme for this 20th season of the Ian Thompson Forum is Democracy's Future. Jack Thompson would have been especially interested in this series and especially pleased to see so many people here this evening to hear Ronald Dworkin speak about democracy and religion, America and Israel. At the conclusion of tonight's lecture, you will have the opportunity to forward questions to Mr. Dworkin during a question and answer session. Please write your questions on the cards provided and pass them to the ushers. And please join us for our next Ian Thompson Forum on November 18th at 7 p.m., when we will welcome Ted Sorensen, former special counsel and advisor to President John F. Kennedy, and a widely published author on the presidency and foreign affairs. I will now ask that Jean Cahan, senior lecturer in philosophy and director of the Norman and Bernice Harris Center for Judaic Studies, to please come forward and introduce our esteemed speaker. Jean.
First of all, I'd like to extend sincerest thanks to Art Thompson and the Thompson Forum Board, and secondarily to all the support staff without whom none of this would be possible. Although in the current political season nothing is uncontroversial, it should be uncontroversial to note that around the globe the theory and practice of democracy is experiencing difficulties. From Pakistan through the Caucasus over to the African continent, the dimensions of democracy that go beyond holding an election are shaky. In the United States, as tonight's guest has noted, we disagree fiercely about almost everything, about terror and security, who is fit to be a judge, and about religion in politics. In Israel, obviously an important component of American foreign policy, disagreement between the secular-minded and the religious often manifests itself in fanatical behavior on both sides. Secularists complain furiously that the country will soon go the way of Algeria and Iran, and the ultra-Orthodox retaliate with slogans referring to the Fourth Reich and Israel Nazis. In both Israel and the United States, then, all parties and factions are often engaged less in reasoned criticism and self-criticism than in simply playing to win. In this situation, it might seem that nothing could be less relevant than philosophy. I would say that, on the contrary, perhaps nothing else can save us now. And that is why it is my privilege to introduce Ronald Dworkin, whose great body of work on the relationships between morality, politics, law, and philosophy has led him to be widely regarded as one of the leading intellects in Western culture of our time. Through his voluminous writings, Dworkin has endeavored to show that underlying the Constitution, our legal rules, decisions, and interpretations are deep moral principles affirming the equality of all. This fundamental equality requires that every individual be treated with equal respect and concern, and it is the essence of our American ideal of democracy. What this fundamental equality actually means, how it relates to freedom, and how it plays out in our everyday lives and in the details of administering public policy, deciding on a system of taxation, deciding such issues as abortion and assisted suicide, and above all, what the arguments are that are put forward on all sides. This is the subject matter of Dworkin's work. On his view, however, the conceptual complexity of these questions does not permit the philosopher, the judge, the politician, or anyone else to try to distance himself, to claim some morally neutral high ground from which to find respite from commitment and action. We are all constantly speaking and acting from within the moral and political community of which we are members. Although I myself have very different attachments from those of Professor Dworkin, I have been very impressed by the empathy and imagination with which he describes the contrasting positions on very bitterly contested issues. And I feel certain that you will sense this empathy as well. Professor Dworkin was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, and educated at Harvard, Yale, and Oxford universities. He was professor of law at Yale from 1962 to 69. In 1969, he was named professor of jurisprudence at Oxford, following the renowned Herbert Hart, and he currently holds the Frank H. Summer Chair of Law and Philosophy at New York University. In 2007, he was awarded the Holberg Prize of Norway, a prize in the humanities that is modeled on the Nobel Prize. The citation from the prize committee refers to the worldwide impact of Professor Dworkin's scholarly work. Dworkin's best-known books include Taking Rights Seriously, 1977, A Matter of Principle, 1985, Law's Empire, 1986, Law's Dominion, 93, Freedom's Law, 1996, and Is Democracy Possible Here, 2006. Please welcome Professor Ronald Dworkin.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be giving the Kripke Lecture as part of this forum. And it is a wonderful day here in Lincoln, Nebraska, that ends in this wonderful way for me. And I can't help being reminded of something that a judge once said to me. When I finished law school, I had the good luck to be a law clerk for a very well-known judge, Learned Hand, he was called. And he sat me opposite him, and in the course of every day, he would break in on the work we were supposed to be doing to ask me a question of some kind, to talk about philosophy. And one day, he was very senior, very actually old at this time. He said to me, Judge Dworkin, do you think much about heaven? And I said, no, tell you the truth, I don't think much about heaven. And he said, would you like to know what heaven is like? Yes, I said, I'd be eternally grateful if you would tell me what heaven is like. He ignored that. And he said, all right, since you ask, I'll tell you what heaven is like. It begins with a polo match. Learned Hand is the captain of the celestial side, and he drives for goal after goal, and the stands ring with his name. They yell, "Go Hand." And then there's lunch. And the conversation at lunch was very good, as you would imagine, given who was at the table. There were dry martinis before lunch and wonderful talk at lunch. And then in the afternoon, a football game. And Hand was the quarterback for the heavenly host. And he scored. He scored 12 touchdowns, passed for some, sneaked some, ran for some. Stands rang with his name, "Go Hand." And then dinner, very dry martinis before dinner. And if you thought the conversation at lunch was good, you should have been at dinner. Epigram followed epigram in a crescendo of wit and elegance, till suddenly a voice was heard to cry out, "Shut up, Voltaire. I want to hear what Hand is saying." Well, now after this wonderful day, I get a chance to talk, and you're going to listen to what I want to say. I want to talk about the relationship between religion and democracy, in particular, what a democratic state's attitude can and must be towards religion. And I start with two assumptions, which I will try to make plain, but very briefly. The first is that democracy is more than just majority rule. In a democracy, conditions are such that majority rule is fair, which means that minorities have certain rights that must be protected, and these are essential to a democracy. Freedom of speech, for example, quite uncontroversial. The second assumption I make is that among these rights that are necessary in a democracy are rights to freedom of worship. Any state, no matter how majoritarian, no matter how frequent its elections, which imposes a faith and forbids people to worship according to the faith that moves them, is not democratic. I hope neither of these propositions is controversial this evening, but they leave open the following distinction. There are two ways in which a democracy can be tolerant of religion, of minority religions and dissent from all religion. We should distinguish between what I will call a religious tolerant state and a secular tolerant state. A religious tolerant state establishes religion as connected to the state. Religion plays a part in public ceremony and occasion. But it is tolerant of dissenting religions and indeed of no religion. A secular religious state has no connection politically as a state with religion, but it tolerates religion, tolerates different forms of religion. So the question for this evening is, must a democracy be a secular tolerant state, or can it be a religious tolerant state? There are examples ready at hand of both kinds of states. France, since 1789, famously a secular tolerant state. When the president of France attended the funeral of the late Pope, he was criticized in the nation's press. He had no business participating officially, even to that degree, in religion. Israel, which I'm going to talk about at some length later, is a fairly pure example on the other side. It's a religious, tolerant state. It does not forbid the practice of any religion, but it identifies itself, indeed, in its basic law as a Jewish state. Great Britain is an interesting example that falls somewhere in between, but I believe that it's just about a secular, tolerant state. The Queen is both head of state and head of the Church of England, but no politician, no prime minister would imagine appealing, as our presidents often do, to religion as authority or support. What then about the United States? The history of the United States on this matter seems to me to show a pendulum swinging back and forth. I just mentioned the political rhetoric. George Bush has constantly cited religion as support. He speaks, when asked what he thinks of his own father, of a higher father, and he called his misadventure in Iraq a crusade. George Romney, when he was vying for the Republican nomination, said that in his opinion, nobody who's not religious can be truly moral. Joe Biden closed the presidential debate by asking God to bless America, and Senator Obama does that often as well. In 1931, a Supreme Court justice said, "We must never forget America is a Christian country." In, I think it was 1962, one of the most liberal of all justices, William O. Douglas, said, "We are a religious country, and our institutions presuppose the existence of a supreme divine being." There's another side. There's the secular religious side. Thomas Jefferson, probably a deist, perhaps an atheist, when he announced the birth of our country, reported to King George that human beings were endowed by a creator with certain rights. But he also said that a wall should be created between church and state, and that wall is enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution, which not only guarantees freedom of worship, but forbids our government to establish a religion. There's a division among constitutional lawyers, however, as to what the force of that separation is, and the Supreme Court, though it abolished prayer in public schools after the Second World War, has in recent years made decisions that suggest a retreat from that view. And I think that on this question of church and state, the pendulum is now poised, and much of the direction that pendulum takes will depend upon who wins the election next Tuesday. It's so nicely divided between these two elements of our history. But our question tonight isn't one of history, it's one of principle. Can we reconcile democracy with the idea that a state that exercises dominion over people of many faiths and over people who have no faith can commit itself officially through its constitutional arrangements and its public speak to one of the religions, or even, as we attempted to do in this country, to monotheistic religion in a more ecumenical way? There's a prima facie, it seems to me, argument that it cannot. And that is the argument I indicated when I said at the outset that democracy is more than majority rule. Democracy must be a partnership that allows each citizen over whom the nation claims dominion and from whom it extracts allegiance to see the government as his government. And that, I would say, is not possible unless government shows to each citizen an equal concern and an equal respect, and to announce that the deepest convictions of any citizen are error because there is a religion which the government supports and makes a matter of patriotism, seems to me to insult a part of the citizenry and is therefore a compromise of democracy. Now, there's a rather powerful argument in the other direction, and it's important to appreciate the character of that opposite argument. It begins, the opposite argument, in realizing that the religion that citizens hold and the state's public announced attitude towards religion creates an environment in which we all live and breathe, and the character of that environment makes a difference to all citizens. It is easier for a Christian, for example, who takes his Christianity seriously, to practice and to have his faith confirmed in a nation where that faith is associated with patriotism. It's easier for such a person to raise his children in a manner that he wishes when there are not rival churches or mocking atheists that he has to confront. That's all by way of saying that people have an interest in what government does and what other people's attitude is towards his or her religion. Now, it's perfectly true that if the majority wishes to have a certain religion established, confirmed, available for instruction and confirmation, then though that is an advantage for them, it's a disadvantage for those of a different faith or for those of no faith. That's perfectly true according to this argument. But there are often situations in which any government policy will advantage some people and disadvantage another. And in a democracy, we follow the principle that numbers count. If the majority wants a certain kind of environment, a certain kind of culture, and the minority doesn't, then fairness requires that the minority defer to the majority. If in the city of Lincoln there were a controversy over whether limited funds should be spent to build a new football stadium or an opera house, and it turned out, as I'm beginning to suspect after one day here, that the football stadium would rather prevail, then that's what democracy is about, according to this argument. 80% of Americans identify monotheistic, Abrahamistic religion as their faith. And if that is so, the interests of the minority must yield. And it shouldn't be taken as an insult to that minority, as I suggested a moment ago. It should simply be taken as, in the same spirit, that opera lovers would take the decision to build the football stadium. In a fair fight, their view lost. That's the opposing argument. That's the argument that many people, many politicians have in recent decades presented, beginning with the fact, as I say, that apparently 80% of people count religion and a monotheistic, ecumenical sort of religion as central to their lives. Now, notice one thing about this argument. It evidently goes too far. Because if that argument were correct, it would not just justify a religious tolerant state, it would justify a religious intolerant state. Because those who want religion presented as official doctrine, religion and patriotism merged, would be even better situated if they did not have to confront mosques, synagogues, and defiling atheists. But that argument is unacceptable if it has that conclusion. And I think it's unacceptable altogether. Why? Because a democracy is a form of government, as I said, in which even losers have got to be able to accept that their state, with whom they can identify, speaks for them. They have to be able to accept that without loss of self-respect. And that means that it's a cardinal principle of democracy that certain decisions must not be taken collectively, even if that benefits a majority, but must be made individually. An environment, a culture, an economic culture, a moral culture, but in this case, a religious culture, can be formed and sustained in either of two ways. It can be sustained and protected collectively. That's what theocracies do. They protect it through a collective decision enforced against everyone. Or it can be protected and sustained organically, which means that we accept that the religious environment in which we live and in which we raise our children is whatever is the result of free people making free choices. And once we accept that, it seems to me, we accept that a true democracy must be in its political nature secular, not religious, particularly if its citizenry is pluralistic in matters of faith. Now, I expect that not everyone in this large audience will accept that, and I hope that we have a moment to discuss it in the question period. But I offer you this, until then, tentative conclusion. A democracy must be secular. It cannot be religious, even if it is tolerant religious. So now we come to the troublesome case of Israel. As I said, Israel fits perfectly my definition of a religious state. Its basic law announces that it is a Jewish state. And if the argument that I've offered you up to now is at all sound, it follows that Israel cannot be a genuine or complete democracy, that it's only a compromised and failed democracy. That would be the implication of the argument that I've made so far. But we have to notice, Israel is different from the United States. Indeed, Israel is special among all states in two crucial ways that might cause us to temper that judgment. It is different in its formation, and it is different in its peril. It was formed after the most hideous massacre that history records, at least in the so-called civilized eras, and it was formed as a refuge for a persecuted and vilified group. Its existence is challenged perpetually by the lands that surround it, many of whom have announced a desire to exterminate the country. Does this make a difference? That's the question that we must now confront. And it's a complicated question, and I'm going to make some simplifying assumptions just to emphasize what I'm not going to talk about. First, I'm not going to touch the question whether the formation of Israel by United Nations mandate and its extension and defense in the initial year of its existence were unjust acts, so that the state has no right to exist. I'm going to assume, if you will, that whatever the argument about that might have been at the time, a kind of historical statute of limitations has run, and Israel is a legitimate state in spite of any questions that might be raised about its formation. Again, that's very controversial, and I'm not meaning to argue for that, but simply to take it off the argumentative table. Secondly, I'm not going to make an argument about Israel's boundaries. I share the opinion of, I think, most friends of Israel who believe that Israel's future will not be secure until what is called a two-state solution is found, and that the proper two-state solution would be one that leaves Israel with boundaries represented by the green line formed after the initial defense of its independence. I believe that the settlers in the West Bank should be offered the choice whether to return to Israel with appropriate compensation or whether to remain a minority in the new Palestine, protected by negotiated constitutional rights. Again, fiercely controversial, but I'm not going to argue about that. I simply tell you that that's the assumption that I make when I ask the question, would that state so created be a true democracy if it remained a Jewish state? Let's consider the ways in which Israel is a Jewish state. I think it's important to see that Israel is a religious state and a Jewish state in three distinct dimensions. First, legally or even constitutionally, Israel is, through its law, a Jewish state. The basic law, the equivalent of a constitution, so announces. Israel's flag is the Star of David. Its national anthem is a Jewish song. Its holidays are the Jewish holidays. It supports the rabbinical hierarchy. And, to my mind, most telling, important parts of its law are simply taken over from religious and Orthodox Jewish law, and in particular, the laws of marriage and divorce, which means that Jews can only marry in Israel if they marry in the ceremonies of the Orthodox faith. So that's the first way in which Israel is not a secular tolerant state, but is plainly a religious tolerant state. The second dimension is its posture to the outside world, expressed in its law of return. The law of return allows Jews everywhere, but in effect only Jews, to become citizens if they come to Israel, And it defines who is a Jew, not in this case according to religious doctrine, but under the very broad category which it took over, in effect, from the Nazi Nuremberg laws. That immigration policy, defined in terms of religious commitment, led, for example, or at least encouraged, in 2003, Israel to adopt a law which said that an Israeli Arab who married someone living in the West Bank could not bring his or her spouse to Israel, and the children of that marriage could not remain in Israel past a defined time. The second way, then, in which Israel is a Jewish state is in its account of who is encouraged and entitled to become a citizen of the nation. The third respect in which Israel is a Jewish state is in the discriminatory character of its national policies. I won't go into very much detail about this. 20% of the citizens of Israel are Israeli Arabs. They live on 4% of the land. This is not in virtue of economics alone. It's in virtue of national policy. When the Arabs fled in the initial wars, their lands were confiscated by the state and made available only to Jews. The state owns, directly or indirectly, enormous amount of the land of Israel. And in spite of the very good efforts of the Supreme Court led by Chief Justice Barak, the government continues to grant leases in a very discriminatory way. The infrastructure of Arab towns, government support of this infrastructure, is dramatically lopsided. I have some figures. In 2002, government ministries budgeted over 11,000 shekels per resident in an Israeli town and about 100 shekels per resident in an Arab town. Education, something of capital importance. The Israeli government runs two separate school systems, a Jewish system and one for Palestinians. And I'm going to quote, in 2001, Human Rights Watch declared, this is the quote, "Their schools are a world apart in quality from the public schools serving Israel's majority Jewish population. Often overcrowded and understaffed, poorly built, badly maintained, or simply unavailable. Schools for Palestinian Arab children offer fewer facilities and educational opportunities than are offered other Israeli children." That was in 2001. But earlier this very month, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel reported discrimination and racism against Israel's Arab citizens have only increased. Now, it's easy, I suspect, too easy for people outside Israel and safe from the terror that people of Israel continue to face to recoil from these figures. And I mention them only to set a certain issue aside. I believe, and so I believe to a great many Israeli citizens, I believe that this third way in which Israel is a Jewish state for Jews is indefensible and undemocratic. And I'm simply going to say that's indefensible and undemocratic and then move on to the other two ways that I distinguished first. So if we ignore the discrimination, then we concentrate our attention on these two ways in which Israel is a Jewish state. It's Jewish in terms of its internal law, and Jewish in terms of its external immigration policy. I make that distinction because in political philosophy, there's an enormous difference between what a nation owes its own residents, what Israel owes the 20% of its citizenry who are Arabs, and what a state owes the rest of the world. I said earlier that a democracy is required to show equal concern and equal respect for its own citizens, but it needn't show equal concern for every person who would like to be a citizen. No nation opens its doors to all those who would like to come. So the question of Jewish immigration raises very different questions from the question I'll first discuss, which is Israel's internal law. Now, I said the argument that leads to the conclusion that the United States compromises its democratic quality insofar as it's a religious state would seem to apply to Israel, but there were two features of Israel that might make its situation different: its foundation, the circumstances of its foundation, and its continued peril. In fact, if we're thinking now about the internal Jewish law, in fact, there are two principles that we might think this different history and this different peril would justify. The two principles are these. The first is a principle of refuge. People who have been subjected to the vilification, the terror, the inhumanity the Jews have suffered not just in the terrible years of the 20th century, but for centuries before that, and not just in the middle of Europe, but across the world. Persuaded people of many different political inclinations in 1945, and persuaded the British government some years before in the Balfour Declaration, that there ought to be a haven for Jews, a place that Jews might come, being able confidently to predict that they would not be the victims of discrimination there. And the principle of refuge is still, it seems to me, an important one. But the principle of refuge requires that there be a genuinely liberal state. That principle does not require that there be a religious state. It requires that there be a place where Jews have a confirmed expectation that they will live without discrimination and persecution. But it does not require that they have a place which is committed by law to the support of their faith. Williamsburg, across the Brooklyn Bridge from where I spend part of the year, is a place where Jews have a great expectation of not being persecuted. But it's not a place in which their law is elevated into the law of the land. So we look to the second principle. That is the principle of self-determination. I must say a word about the background, the historical background of that principle. Anthropologists, ethnologists, use the term nation in two quite different ways. They speak of an ethno-nation, which means a group of people who may live in many different political communities, but are gathered together by something they share, perhaps a faith, perhaps a language, perhaps common myths, a heritage that connects them with one another, perhaps a genetic tie of some kind. That is an ethno-nation. A civic nation is a political community enjoying sovereignty and independence. The United States is a civic nation, but we are not an ethnic nation. According to many people, we're made up of many ethnic nations, but I think that itself is an overstatement. In the 19th century, particularly, as part of a certain period of very romantic nationalism, the idea took root that ethno-nations ought each to have a civic nation of their own. Thus was born the concept, the modern concept, of a nation-state. And this idea was tremendously influential, particularly in the center of Europe, in the history of the Balkans, for example. The idea, the pulls and tugs of the idea of nation-states, combining ethnic and civic nationality, was a very powerful influence. Zionism was created at the height of the enthusiasm for the idea of ethnic nations and civic nations. And that is what people have in mind when they say an ethnic nation has a right to self-determination. That means an ethnic nation has a right that there be someplace in the world a political community organized around them and dedicated to the preservation of that links them together, the language, the faith, the heritage. That is the argument, it seems to me, the strongest argument there is, that Israel should be regarded as an exception to my principle about religion and democracy. It's an argument that's been developed by many different authors, but I would recommend to you especially a recent book by Chaim Gans, a professor of law at the University of Tel Aviv, which is called A Just Zionism, a very careful book in which he uses the principle of self-determination to defend Zionism, and though he condemns the discrimination, the internal discrimination that I reported, he nevertheless says Israel can be both democratic and Jewish because of the right of self-determination. And when asked to defend, or asking himself to defend the right of self-determination, he says, you defend this right by pointing to the very fundamental interest that people have, just as human beings, the very fundamental interest they have in wanting their ethno-nation, their common heritage, to be nourished, protected, and made available for the future. That's his argument. I don't think it's good enough. And I want to point out to you 3 reasons why I think the argument from self-determination fails to establish the proposition that Israel can be Jewish in the legal sense and at the same time democratic. First, again, this is something which I'm going to say quite quickly, but I hope we'll have time to discuss. Well, I don't believe that Jews, as defined, for example, in the law of return, form an ethno-nation at all. I don't believe that there is anything common to the Jews of Lincoln, Nebraska, the suburbs of Moscow, and Ethiopia. There's not a common faith, not a common language, not, so far as I can see, a common stock of myths or a sense of shared history. Some of them have, but not, I think, most. If there's a genetic link, it's the kind of link that Wittgenstein called a link through family resemblances. There may be genetic links between one person and another, which can be traced to a common source, but that link would be different, and there'd be no single genetic trait across the whole population. Now, perhaps I'm wrong about that. Perhaps some of you think I am wrong about that. So let's assume there is an ethno-nation. I would challenge, secondly, Chaim Ganz's argument about how many people in that ethno-nation have the interest he describes. This kind of an interest is a matter of self-image. It's a matter of how you identify yourself to yourself. What counts in your overall sense of personality and allegiance? And I don't believe that there are vast numbers of Jews. Well, perhaps there are vast numbers, but it isn't anything like approaching the whole of that enormously large ethno-nation that has that character of self-identification. It may be, some Jews may, who are philosophers, for example, may feel a self-identity that ties them to a Polish logician or a Swedish metaphysician more than Jews in remote countries who lead entirely different kinds of lives. Let's suppose that I'm wrong about that too. That leaves the question, why do we suppose that an interest is equivalent to a right? There are many ethno-groups throughout the world. There are too many, far too many, for us to say that each one of them has a right to an economically viable piece of real estate on the Earth's surface, let alone one that has some historical meaning to them. Think of the ethno-nations almost at war with one another in the Middle East, for example, outside of Israel. In general, we cannot say that just because it's good for people to have something, they have a right to have it. As I drive around the United States, I find I have a great desire to be able to hear decent music on my car radio and not just hippity-hop all over the place. But I do not claim that I have a right to be free from hippity-hop when I turn on my car radio. Now, it may sound a harsh thing to say, but I think the more seriously we take the proposition that every ethno-group, every ethno-nation has a right to become a sustainable political nation, then I think we realize that much more argument needs to be supplied. So, I suggest to you that the right of self-determination, that right certainly, that sentiment certainly important in the foundation of Zionism as well as other very powerful 19th century ideologies, won't serve to conquer the argument I began with. Israel exercises dominion over an entire population, 20% of which is not Jewish. And I believe that it owes equal concern and respect to that entire nation. And there is no argument to be found in either the principle of refuge or the principle of self-determination to the contrary. What about immigration? The other way I distinguished in which Israel is a Jewish state. As I said, no nation owes equal concern to people who are not its citizens but wish to be. A nation is entitled to choose among those to protect itself, to serve the interests of those who are already citizens, and particularly to guarantee its survival as the kind of state it is. We can argue about what other requirements of justice a nation should respect in its immigration policy, but we cannot apply the same standard of equal concern to the world that we hold a nation to when dealing with its own citizens. Still, there are limits to the immigration policy any nation can adopt. And one limit comes out of the requirement of equal concern to its own citizens. It may not adopt an immigration policy that shows disrespect for a large group, or indeed any, of its own citizens. The United States has very strict immigration policies, but these are not framed in terms of saying we already have too many Baptists or Jews. We need more white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You may think that sometimes the immigration policy is designed to achieve that result, but it cannot openly insult a portion of those over whom it claims dominion. Now, if I'm right, Israel is in a paradox. It may choose an immigration policy to protect its survival. If Israel were, this is my belief, to open the way for the return of any Palestinian who wished to live in Israel, the nation would be swamped and it would become a very different kind of nation. It has a right to protect its existence, but it may not do so in ways that show disrespect for its own population or any part of it. And it follows, it seems to me, that Israel can escape this paradox in only one way, and that is by ceasing to treat itself as a Jewish nation. It can treat itself as a liberal nation. It can design an immigration policy, first to admit people, as other nations do, who can be expected to play a useful and self-sustaining role as citizens, but second, and in the case of Israel, all the more important, it can dedicate itself to admitting people who have shown respect for commitment to a liberal state, which means, I've been arguing, a secular state. And I believe that an adequately policed immigration policy of that sort, in substitution for the doctrinaire right of return policy, is feasible, can be administered, and would not jeopardize the future of Israel so long as Israel conceived itself a secular, liberal state in which Jews were safe. What are the risks? There probably are risks in this transformation. I said earlier that I was assuming, I do believe this, that certainly within days that most of you will see, the two-state solution will become a reality. In this case, I believe that Israel's security would be enhanced by its ceasing to become, in the discriminatory way, a Jewish state. Two points I'll make rather quickly about that. Israel's natural friends, its natural diplomatic supporters, for example, throughout Europe, often find it difficult to sustain their support for Israel, and I believe would find it much less difficult if Israel became more secular and less discriminatory in its policy. Secondly, I believe, again, this is hostage to fortune, I believe that Israel's perilous position is amongst its neighbors is in fact accounted for by the fact that it claims itself to represent a religion and therefore invites the most unreasoned, the most ferocious form of hostility, which is religious jihad. Yes, there are risks. It doesn't seem to me that Israel setting itself on a course of becoming a secular, tolerant state is any riskier than the course in which it now pursues. I've tried your patience. I'll close not by attempting any summary, but a rather self-indulgent way, by saying that if Israel did become more secular, more in the spirit that I've described, democratic, there's an important sense in which it would thereby become more of a Jewish state, not political, not in a political sense, but in what we might call a secular, ideological sense. For many centuries, on the whole, and in the main, important qualifications, the Jews of the diaspora spreading out across continents have been among the most effective carriers of the Enlightenment creed, most effective adherents to the values of reason, equality, democracy. Those Enlightenment values were the nourishment for all modern forms of democracy. And if Jews succeeded in creating a more perfect democracy on the shores of the Mediterranean, it seems to me that they would have done a better job of creating a state in their own best image. Thank you.